So it sounds a little bit pedantic, but it's really not. I'm coming back to the question, which I think is a really important question, about who was organising the exhibitions that were going to Europe and why. And in fact, you were saying, Jason, about you thought that the first shows there was just not enough money being invested. But in fact, the history of those shows, the first ones, are extremely interesting and has to do with the politics in China that probably many people in this room know better than I do. But the first thing that my Chinese scholars and friends always remind me is that in 1924, modern China was exactly, not even 15 years old, 13 years old. And there was enormous instability in the government and in the people who were being appointed in that immediate period. So Lu Xun went there, and then he was kicked out, and then he had to leave Beijing, and then there was Lin Fengmian, who I mentioned. He was appointed, then he had to leave, and they would go south. And there started to be a big separation between Beijing and Shanghai, and the further away you got from Beijing, the more autonomy that you had in terms of experimentation and what it was you were doing. And my great hero, who I don't actually mention, I had to take his name out because I had to cut back on my length, but my great hero is a man called Tsai Yuan-pei. And Tsai Yuan-pei was a scholar who had studied in Germany, and just an extraordinary man who was appointed the first Minister of Education of the Republic of China. And if you track all the shows that happened, many of them, if not most of them, were at his initiation. And this very first one, two things happened which were very important. The first was in France. There was a creation of a China Institute in Lyon, I think it was, and another China Institute in Frankfurt. And at that point, there started, through those organizations, there started to be an assembly of great scholars. And one of them was a man called William Cohen. And for those of you who know the British system, William Cohen, who was key to all of these exhibitions taking place in China in Europe later, was driven out of Germany. Most sinologists, all these shows are going on like up to 1937, but by 1936 and 1937, William Cohen had a Arbeitsverbot. He was forbidden to work, forbidden to teach, and had to flee Germany and ended up in Oxford, where he founded the school there, and a lot of the collection that is actually at the Ashmolean came from him. So what you had in 1924 with the very first exhibition, Tsai Yuan-pei himself had been thrown out, and he went to Europe briefly, and he gathered together all of the artists who had been working in Europe, brought them together to show their works. But nobody in Europe was ready for a modern China. They weren't conceptually ready. And the other thing that was going on with all these exhibitions is that there was personal envy, personal jealousy, personal ambition. And the two great figures who were competing with one another were Liu Haisu and Xu Baihong. And the Xu Baihong show that went to Paris, he'd send back notices and say, this is the first exhibition ever. And Liu Haisu would write back to China and say, mine was the first exhibition ever. And they tried to demolish one another with their own special projects until finally Tsai Yuan-pei said in 1934 and 35, enough's enough, our country needs us to join forces. And he managed to get Xu Baihong, Liu Haisu, and the various schools to come together to create this one exhibition, which is why the 1934-35 was so important, and it was the first one to get the national support from the other governments. So in other words, you have all these forces coming together at one time, personal, political. Yeah, do you want to add?
No, I don't want to interrupt.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. This is my friend.
Actually,
no, but I just want to make one other point about these Chinese, these exhibitions sent overseas to represent China. I just want to make the point that the whole idea of having an exhibition of art is a new thing in the Chinese context. A traditional paradigm is more about private transfer of so whether it's exhibitions for overseas or whether it's exhibitions at home for a national audience, developing a sense of a public for art and making people through art feel that they are one people or something like that. It's all that whole culture is really so new. So it's unsurprising if there are some steps to be made to work out how to do it, to represent yourself to others, let alone to represent yourself to yourself, to get yourself to feel you are yourself or whatever, so.
I wanted to step back. I think this is also a mic. Is this talking? Yeah. I wanted to step back and kind of look at a broader issue that is what kind of brought us together, and that is, actually it started with a conversation with Natsu, who should be up here, by the way, because you're definitely a presenter and part of all this. Don't we have another chair?
I could find a chair.
So early on, Natsu and I were having this exchange about how a symposium could relate to Jipaishi and Isamu Noguchi in 1930 and all of that. And I sent a message, I hope Natsu forgives me, but I said, I would strongly like to see the rubric East and West removed from the title. And Natsu so kindly indulged this rather selfish request. And so the term encounter, it came up as an alternative mechanism for dealing with some of the issues that have often been addressed under the East-West kind of rubric. And so I think it's, a really good opportunity to take stock and see how that worked out with the various papers, and especially, we had great respondents today, and this issue and dissatisfaction with this East-West kind of rubric came up several times, and so I'm thinking about, okay, so how does encounter, how does it function? And like our collective works, I think, start to map out a framework for thinking about what encounters are and what the dangers are, and how they play out. And I think Natsu's exhibition is like one extraordinary statement. Apart from what happened between Isamu Noguchi and Jipaishi in 1930, what happens upstairs because of your installation is this extraordinary intershuffling of works that kind of provide like these endless opportunities for comparison and for contrasting and for thinking about these terms, and falling back on like an East-West binary just won't do it. It's much more subtle and much more localized than that. And then I'm thinking of Yasuko's paper where you have Koyama, who, what is he? He's an engineer of encounters between lineages. He's like taking Picasso's ceramics and saying, that's not part of the lineage of Japanese ceramics. And then he's generating this new lineage in Japan, in Japanese ceramics, that's called international ceramics. And it's quite extraordinary. And then David is, he's like recommending to us that we need this multifaceted, situated way of looking at world art history, and it's going to look different depending on where you stand. And that's, I think, a really fruitful recommendation for us to try.
At this point, we should be breaking things down rather than trying to build them into one big structure. Because if you do that, it'll end up being a Western structure somehow. I mean, one example I think of is David Summers' Real Spaces, which to me is trying to kind of map everything into one story. And I feel it's a little bit too soon to do that.
So if you have like these encounters that are now narrations on the part of art historians that are situated variously, then, you come up with things like, I mean, in a way, your paper is a very sort of discouraging sense of what an encounter is, because it kills the artists, right? They end up dying in the end. It's kind of very tragic.
Well, I just don't want a happy story that all encounter is a good thing, because we have to take account of, imperialism, colonialism, which is still a reality in the world up till today, in new forms, constantly being reinvented, inequalities of power. So we need to be aware of that background, not in some rigid way to look at things, but just aware that I want to see dialogue, but I'm aware that dialogue is often from uneven positions of power.
So it's easier for some people to have encounters than others, and
well, you'll be encountered with whether you want to or not, as it were. So,
I mean, I think that in Joanne's paper, this from Lu Xun, this active positivist, we are going to go out and aggressively search for encounters. We're going to get them, and that's a good thing. There's nothing to be ashamed about. But then there's another moment in your paper where there's this term broken tradition, and I wondered what if that insinuates a need to repair it or to like fix it, or to that its unbroken condition is something to go back to, and if the encounter is responsible in part for breaking it.
Boy, that's a question. My mind is leaping from one place to the other. Two stories, one from 1929, which is the first national art exhibition in China. And they brought in work from Europe, French work, German work, and a large contingency from Japan. And it launched a huge debate, a very, very public debate between Xu Baihong and, what is his name? Sorry? Yes. And the big debate, it was called I Am Confused. And basically what Xu Baihong said was that he thought that the French artists were superficial, that it was a market, that Cubism was just a market development, and that the real tradition that should be looked at were, the great painters, many of whom were German in his eyes. And the big public debate was about whether or not Xu Baihong was just, a boring young man who didn't know how to accept modernism. And I tell that story to come back to the point that you made earlier about having to this global idea of what the West and the East. There is no single East, but there is no single West, and that these encounters that were going on one. Depending on where the studies were, or the emotions were, or the skills were, or the passions were of those who were encountering it and being encountered, the results were completely different. So in terms of the German traditions, the irony out of all of this was that the artists that Xu Baihong was praising had already long been thrown out by the European modern as being irrelevant. And they wanted to break with that tradition as well. So you've got this this sort of real mixture going on there. Now, to come back to the question of whether or not that was something in the past, there are some very interesting scholars right now in China who are trying to come back to the traditional model of aesthetics. And one of them is the theory of Yi. And this was an aesthetic theory that was developed back in, I think, 1000 or something, and AD. And now there are Chinese scholars and theoreticians and very famous curators, including the curator of the great 1989 show that led to what some people call the beginning of modernism. They are now trying to assess contemporary work in the light of Chinese aesthetics. They are trying to recuperate a tradition because it was broken. So if you look at those two narratives, the stories are of trying to bridge traditions that can no longer be recuperated, but trying to find a new place for them within discussion on contemporary practice.
Maybe that also relates to Christina's approach toward this problem of like saying, hey, it's not East and West or Japan and the U.S. There's like a third term. And, maybe that's where it happens. I think you used an interesting term, the generative context of this contact zone, and, how Aborigines are actually maybe the fulcrum of a relationship there. Does that sound like another kind of encounter? It sounds like it's a fruitful approach for your work.
No, absolutely. I first came in contact with the word contact zone by reading the work of Mary Louise Pratt, and she works on travel writing. And I was interested in a lot of these early travelers and kind of their initial encounters and contacts with native peoples, and she uses it. And the reason I liked it is maybe the same reason that I like the way Celeste defined encounter earlier, in the sense that on the one hand, it's this grappling. It can be seen in a positive light. You're struggling in a generative way, in a creative way. On the other hand, there might be some problematic aspects of it. And an encounter or a contact zone, there are necessarily issues of domination and subordination in unequal power structures. And this is something that I think David tries to get beyond in his talk, absolutely. So in a sense, I like the idea that you have these zones of interaction. And I guess for me, the idea of an encounter not being necessarily between one person and one person, the fact that it's defined by multiple actors, and not only encounters with people, in my case also an encounter with a dead person, in the case of Matsuda, but also the encounter with objects, and the encounter with cultures and these kinds of things. So it's a really uneven, but it's an interesting landscape.
Jason, in your work, it struck me, this incredible exhibition, International Chinese Exhibition in 1935, and you suggested there's a kind of nationalist competition involved, if I read you correctly, between the various nations submitting Chinese works to that exhibition. You have a list of 13 nations that includes Turkey and India and Sweden, and I mean, I can understand Japanese competition there. I can understand Korean and Chinese, but how does that kind of friction? What is the nationalistic advantage for a country like Sweden or India, or how does that work?
I think I started working on that 35 show. I was at the Nelson Atkins. And in 35, the Nelson was only a couple years old. Sickman made it a point to give the best pieces off display and get them there, no matter what. And that set a stage that he competed against Boston. It was his 20-something, famous for his collection 20, 30 years already by the time it gets to this Nelson being formed. So I always saw it as a competition, or at least someone to ignite you to show your collections and share the collections. But it's also definitely has imperial roots because, of course, Sweden wants to show off that they did find the Peking man bones. They do have a great collection. They did document. France and Britain were fighting for cave findings of paintings and sculptures. And that's why they're in national collections. And so I think there is a competition. First of all, it was to get there, find it first, and mapping, and then control, define where the zones are, and then take natural resources, and then commercial interests. I think there's always these, not evolutionary, but steps that happen naturally, and it's competitive in nature. So.
It's interesting. It's kind of a post-colonial studies approach, which says that just like the imperial powers are carving up Africa and other parts of the world, so these, art historians and anthropologists are carving up the archaeological...
Or even the market. I have to compete to get a piece. Yeah, so there's always, I think there is a competition. Maybe it's not the right word. Encounters. Encountering challenges. But I think there is this jostling for position.
In relation to that, I have a question about the various kinds of competitive encounters. How about different fields, or since I addressed this problem of ceramic, which has been considered sort of inferior or unimportant in comparison to paintings, sculpture, even perhaps prints. I'm just wondering, so many of your talks dealt with this very interesting earlier exhibitions in 1920s and 30s. How were Chinese ceramic works represented? Were they considered important enough to represent the nation in comparison to sort of paintings, either old or new?
In the first exhibition, the one that Tsai Yuan-pei put together, they brought the modern painting, but they had quite a large section, very large section was historical material, but it were including ceramics, including embroidery. In fact, that was one of the things with the 1929 National Exhibition. It included a huge section on embroidery as well. So the notion of culture was very diversified, but the ones in the 24 exhibition did not come from China. They gathered together all the collectors, the Chinese collectors who were living in Europe. And that's where the objects came from. That was just the first one. And that's a different show. The one that Jason's talking about is of course, a major object, major and very important historical objects. But this was from private sources.
I think there's something about at least in the Chinese context, the special cultural value of the brush tradition, that so maybe that's something to do with Noguchi engaging with the brush even though he's primarily a sculptor, because that's where there's a sense of the three-dimensionality of tradition is to be found, that it has a cultural status that three-dimensional objects maybe don't have in quite the same way. I'm struck, for example, in modern Hong Kong sculptors who want to emphasize their Chineseness. Like there's one called Van Lau, and he will make sculptures of bamboo, because bamboo is a kind of valorized subject for Chinese painting. He can't really find a route in Chinese sculpture that he can connect to his Chineseness through in the same way.
One of the things he did set out to do in China and then even in Japan is to find, I think the term is a Tang figurine faker, somebody who was making these tomb figurines as fakes, and presumably he wanted to absorb some of that skill and formal quality and produce modern sculpture. But another question for Natsu is, you've done all this great work, and now you have the luxury to see these works hanging side by side And does it change your sense of the encounter that, is the topic of the exhibition?
Just listening to what others were talking about, the encounter and the sort of problematic side of this particular encounter, and what was, if there are any injuries, how Noguchi interpreted Chibashi's works, but in his very sort of coming from the West, very in maybe a little bit arrogant way. I wonder if there's any, and I guess I've been thinking about that. I haven't really come to find some answers, but it become my question to you is if you see maybe Bert maybe can say something about that.
I'm gonna slip away from that because I saw that Alex had something he wanted to say.
So this is just a very brief question to follow on what you were talking about earlier. It seems to me that the views we saw of the 34-35 exhibition actually were installed in a very interesting way, that you have the paintings and there were a lot of objects. And I'm just wondering, I mean, there's the Chinese view of what is significant, which would have put the brush painting very high up. These exhibitions seem to be presenting a rather different picture. The international exhibitions seem to be emphasizing well, I could put it one way. If, let's say, France was going to be represented in China, it would probably be an exhibition of French painting. The Chinese, the Western constitution of what a Chinese exhibition should be, is this thing which looks, I mean, it almost looks decorative. You've got a few paintings, you've got some ceramics, and and interesting that it's embroidery as well. I mean, you just would not include that in a Western show of Western art going to East. So I wondered if you've got any comments on the sort of disparity between a Chinese self-representation and then the representation of China through these international exhibitions.
I think we need to make distinctions between the shows, because the one that I keep coming back to as the model is the 1934 that traveled through to 35 that started in Berlin, where William Cohen was involved, where Tsai Yuan-pei was involved, and all of the leading modernists. And that exhibition did not have any embroidery. Those paintings, those modern, what they call modern ink paintings, were hung in a row as if it was, the standard Western presentation, or even in China, of the individual objects next to one another in a very clearly defined exhibition format, and they were not hung high, and they were not intended to be presented as in a salon hang. I don't know if you want to add to that.
I think there's just the works themselves. Scrolls are only meant to be out for a little bit, then they roll back up. So already the exhibition changes the appreciation. But then there were arguments in the Burlington magazine about critiques about how the show was hung, because some of the paintings were so high and you couldn't read the inscription. So there were critiques already in the London show, and I think it just is trying to make public something that was never meant to be public. It's supposed to be with a group of us, just look at it and shut it, because we're privileged already because we can understand it and appreciate. So that privilege to make public is very difficult, and it was a hard time for getting people to appreciate it by introducing them. But it's a privileged state that's even now trying very difficult for us to put it on display and get people to engage it in a meaningful way.
There's maybe an interesting comparison of Japanese exhibitions that were very deliberate self-representations overseas. And one dramatic moment in that evolution was when the first post-war Japanese exhibition comes to the U.S., and there's an attempt to alter the image of Japanese art history and take it away from small objects and focus instead on monumental big objects. So instead of little netsuke and tsuba sword guards and things that, allow Americans to say Japanese people are little too. There's suddenly these large Buddhist sculptures that have a monumental quality to them, and that was very effective in elevating the sort of the image of Japanese art from craft, little dainty, crafty, intricate kinds of things to something substantial. Celeste.
Yeah. I just wanted to follow up on that and make another little